the moment of the covenant with Abraham is not any particular scene or any particular phrase, but it plays out throughout the story of Abraham, at least until he has his son Isaac. And one of the pivotal moments of that covenant process with Abraham, the development of that covenant with Abraham, is when his name is changed from Abram. It's not too much of a change, but it does mark a split from everything he was in the past. He was no longer in Ur of the Chaldeans. He was in a new land. He was no longer to focus on the other gods, which later Revelation would indicate did not exist, but only on this one God. And now he was to carry a new name along with this new covenant. And we have other examples of that throughout the scriptures. When God inserts himself into the lives of important people, there is a change of name that goes with that new identity and that new connection with God. First, we have Sarah, a name changed from Sarai, Abraham's wife. Hagar did not have a change in name. Sarah did. And it was her child that would carry on the promise of that covenant. Jacob was born Jacob, but after wrestling with the angel, it was declared his name to be changed. No longer Jacob, but Israel. In the New Testament, we have Simon, who, once Jesus called him to that special task of being not just an apostle, but the unifying leader of all the apostles, was no longer to be known as Simon, but Peter. And we see the same thing with Saul. Once there was that experience of the road to Damascus, it wasn't so much declared that his name would be now Paul, but he himself took on the new name, casting aside his identity from the past and focusing now and in the future on his call by Christ. And so he changed his name from Saul to Paul. There might be other name changes that we don't know about indicated in the scriptures. I like to point out that of the 12 apostles and the listings of the 12 apostles, we see name changes between lists. For example, there's Thaddeus in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, but no Thaddeus in John, and in any listing by Luke, there's no Thaddeus, but rather Jude. Ergo, we have the Saint Jude Thaddeus, which could, for all we know, be two different men of a company of apostles, and each evangelist chose one over the other for their purposes and their reasons. But it could have been one person who started out with one name and changed it to another. The same could be said for Bartholomew and Nathaniel, or the story of Levi and the story of Matthew. Word for word, exactly the same. Matthew in the Gospel of Matthew, Levi in the Gospel of Luke. Perhaps two different people, or perhaps indication of a name change, not noted by the evangelists, but we see that result in their finished products, at least of the four evangelists. Who knows? Also, we see it throughout our church's history. What are the practices, for example, of the Holy Father when he takes on his role? It's rather interesting, the origin of that. It was around the 3rd or 4th century, and the Holy Father, the Bishop of Rome, chosen by the church, his given name by his parents was actually Mercury. Well, it wouldn't do to have the Bishop of Rome named for a Roman god, so he changed his name. In the practice, I don't know if it picked up right at that point, but it eventually became a regular habit. And then that name change came to reflect, especially in the last century, a sense of mission for that particular Holy Father. John Paul II, I'm told, wanted to take the name Stanislaus, but in deference to his immediate predecessor, who took the name John Paul to indicate his continuance of the reforms of Vatican II, led by John the 23rd and Paul VI, he took the name John Paul. And out of deference to that, what would have been Pope Stanislaus took the name from Karol Wojtyła to John Paul II. And now that name is synonymous with such great worldwide reform, which in effect was part of the essence of the Second Vatican Council, is the church in the modern world and its presence in the modern world. Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger took the name Benedict after the patron saint of Europe because he saw a real value in the new evangelization and the clarification of not just the teachings, but the reasons behind the teachings of the church and the substance behind the teachings. And regardless of differences in personality, we cannot deny that Pope Benedict was first and foremost a teacher. A teacher. And his weekly audiences became catechesis, in which he would talk about the teachings of the church, even some of the difficult ones. And of course we have Pope Francis, who took the name, reminded of a certain mission of the church when the cardinal next to him, Franciscan from Brazil, turned to him and said, "Be good to the poor." And as Pope Francis shares, it was in that he was remembered the essence of his own mission as a priest, as a bishop, as a cardinal, as an ordinary of Buenos Aires, to get back to basics, be good to the poor, renew ourselves in the teachings of the church, go out to the peripheries to see the people who are on the peripheries and call them in, seeking out the lost, being pastoral to those who might be otherwise considered sinners. And the name Francis seemed to have encompassed all that. Not only that, but I actually noticed before he clarified Francis of Assisi, some were speculating he's a Jesuit. Maybe he named it after Francis Xavier. Again, a mission of evangelization, very much prominent in the church today. Or it could have been another Jesuit, actually the second successor of Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Borgia, whose great-grandfather was a pope, and on his mother's side, she was the illegitimate daughter of a bishop who was the illegitimate son of a king. Holiness that grew out of scandal, which has been something our church has been facing worldwide in recent years. So Francis encompasses so much, and what it reflects, that simple name change in now our leader for 2 years. It doesn't end there. People who enter the religious life, more often than not, will take on a new name. Some to reflect their new life as a religious in a community of religious brothers or sisters. And there are some communities that still do that take on the new name. But all, if not most of us, when we received the sacrament of confirmation, what did we do? We took on a name, indicating God's insertion into our lives. I took the name Leo, in part because I couldn't come up with any other, and I am a Leo. Just glad I wasn't a Capricorn or a Pisces. If I were under the twins, I might have taken Thomas. But then looking up Leo, Pope St. Leo I, also known as Leo the Great, and the courage and resourcefulness he had in stopping Attila the Hun, taught me there's no such thing as an impossible situation. And throughout my life, I've always remembered that. But also the impact he had with regard to church teaching, church doctrine, the institution of the papacy, the organization of the church, and so on. St. Leo was an important saint for me. And others have chosen names from saints who I hope they wish to emulate or who they admire for their holiness, and taking on that name as at least an indication from the name that God is now a major part of their lives. And that's nothing new. It goes all the way back to that first recipient of the covenant, Abram. And that part of the covenant deal we hear in today's first reading. When he accepted God as his God, and God made the covenant with him, he was a new man with a new identity to be the father of a new people. So it's appropriate that he would take on a new name.